The question is, what does Urban Meyer do? Will Tim Tebow be a major part of the offense, or is he even going to make it out of training camp? That's a laughable storyline we'll talk about now. But the AFC South preseason division power rankings continues on here today. I'm Cody Roark, Pro Football Network, joined alongside lead NFL analyst Dalton Miller and Ian Cummings as we break down how we see, based on the offseason moves that each team has made, where the teams lie in the division before the season even begins. And starting things off, Dalton, we look at this AFC South division, a lot of question marks. Specifically, there's two teams that stand out as powerhouses within the division, and obviously a team that really just kind of went wholesale bargain in free agency with the Houston Texans, and then the Jaguars, who had the number one overall pick. They've got their franchise guy, but the division right there, I think, still is top heavy. Do you agree with that notion right now?
It's definitely top heavy. You know, I'm doing all of these camp storylines to watch the divisional previews, and I said, you know, this might be one of the worst divisions in the NFL from top to bottom. You have the Colts and you have the Titans that I think are good teams, but you have legitimate questions with each one of those teams as well. You know, I said it's a bad division, but from a what to watch perspective for this division, it might be arguably the most impressive division to watch this season. You have a first-year NFL head coach who is coming from the college ranks that has a ton of interesting history in his coaching career. He's always won wherever he's been. He's turned programs around and then a couple of times left those programs in shambles. It will be very intriguing to see what Urban Meyer does in Jacksonville. The 11-win Indianapolis Colts, they saw their quarterback leave, retire, and then they went with a total reclamation project in Carson Wentz, somebody who from the ground up needs rebuilt. Mechanics, his feet, his footwork, his midsection, his arm is still okay, but that's about all that is good about him too, because he completely lost his composure last year when there was just a hint of adversity thrown his way. So I am very much intrigued to see what happens with Carson Wentz moving forward. That's the biggest storyline for me. Can Carson Wentz just be good enough to take who I believe is the best roster in the Colts and have them win the division? Because I do think they are a better football team overall than the Tennessee Titans. Tennessee Titans, I think, are the second best team overall. They have the best quarterback. They have the two best wide receivers, and their offensive line is pretty good. But that secondary is very, very bad for the Tennessee Titans. There are a lot of unknowns with that team. They weren't a very good pass rushing team last year either. Now, they went out in free agency and tried to address that. But it's going to come down to, in my opinion, what happens with Carson Wentz, because I do think last year that team won 11-5 and didn't even get very good Phillip Rivers either. Can he relight that flame that he had with Frank Reich? It remains to be seen. I have my questions about it. And then at the bottom of the division, you have the Houston Texans and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I think the Jags are going to be the better football team. We don't know what's happening with the Deshaun Watson situation. That's something that I'm not even going to get into. But if he plays this season, I think they're another, 4 or 5 win team. I sat down and I watched his film when I was comparing him and Dak Prescott, for a piece that I wrote a little while back. And what he did in 2020, given his situation, was incredible. That team still won 4 games. I think if he does not play in 2021 for the Houston Texans, they might not win a single football game this year. That is how depleted that roster is. That is how ran into the ground that franchise has become. It's unfortunate because just a couple of years ago, they were controlling the AFC South.
And I think that there were a lot of questions too about just the trajectory. I mean, you mentioned all the storylines within the division. I even think with the loss at wide receiver too, you have different guys going elsewhere. Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins a few years ago being traded to, that was a big issue for Deshaun Watson. He still elevated guys, but now that wide receiver room looks so different now than it was last year that I think that is an obstacle for the Texans. Now, Ian, I want to know what you think. I mean, do you align with Dalton a little bit? Because I think it's common consensus for the most part. We look at this division and it's easy to make the argument that Indy and Tennessee are probably going to be vying for the top spot. There is a week 3 matchup between those two teams that I feel like could really set the tone for the season. How do you see the division shaping out?
Yeah, I'm probably going to go with the same, and it's boring again. I mean, agreeing with Dalton again, but it's a top-heavy division. It's weird too because we talk about the AFC. There are a few teams that we can look at right now, and we can say those are the teams that are going to be competing for an AFC championship. Like Cleveland, Baltimore, Buffalo, Kansas City. I don't think any of the teams in this division, even though it's top-heavy, are necessarily like legitimate AFC championship contenders. I think there's a little bit that both of them have to do before they reach that point. And again, that kind of like that sheds light on how bad the bottom of it is, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I'm going to talk about Tennessee and Indianapolis now. I do think that these teams, and it's interesting because these are two teams that always seem to be competing with one another. Like every year, who's going to win the division, Indianapolis or Tennessee? You know, none of the other teams really factor in, at least lately. You know, usually it's these two teams duking it out. And, you know, gun to my head, my gut feeling, I kind of like the Titans a little bit better just because I love that aggressive move to get Julio Jones. I love that move. I think the offensive line, I think Nate Davis is coming into his own as one of the better guards in the league. They do need to get a tackle opposite 𝗬𝗓𝗪, but I do like Dylan Radunz. I thought he showed some good things in the draft process at the Senior Bowl. He had a really nice performance there where he kind of grew over time, which makes you think maybe the NFL won't be too big for him. Maybe he can file into that spot. But again, I think Ryan Tannehill is a little bit of an underappreciated quarterback too. I think if you pit him and Carson Wentz against each other, Wentz of last year, head and shoulders above Wentz, Tannehill is. So I think that is a big tipping point. And then also defensively, that secondary does need some time to grow. I'm not going to dispute that at all. But they do have some good young pieces. I mean, you look at Caleb Farley, Christian Fulton, Elijah Molden to complement Kevin Byard at safety. It's a group that maybe could find its footing over the course of the season, but I will agree with Dalton. It's probably not going to be pretty early on. There's going to be a learning curve for those guys. But then on the defensive line too, I mean, you add Bud Dupree, you get that pressure in there opposite Harold Landry. And then also on the defensive line, they have 𝗍𝗍𝗓𝗏 alongside Jeffrey Simmons. I think that's one of the underrated three technique duos that you'll see across the league. I think both of those guys are very good, very underappreciated. But then looking at the Colts too, they also have a very strong roster. Aside from Wentz, whatever he does at quarterback, that's going to be the biggest storyline for them. But if Frank Reich can unlock his previous play where he was a borderline MVP candidate a few years back, they can legitimately take the division from the Titans and really not make it a competition. I mean, that team is very strong. You look at the secondary, I think they have the edge there with Kenny Moore, one of the best slot corners in the league, Julian Blackmon, Kari Willis. They have some good linebackers, Darius Leonard coming back, and Bobby Okereke. And then that defensive line too, man. I mean, DeForest Buckner, Grover Stewart. I mean, there's a lot of talent there, And on the edge too, they got 𝗏𝗏𝗡. He's going to provide them an infusion of talent. And their offensive line, I think is the best in the division. I think you really can't argue that it's not. I mean, Quentin Nelson coming back. I mean, you got the question is at right tackle, or I think left tackle with Anthony Costanzo retiring. Yeah, but I think they got Eric Fisher, right, and Sam Tevi. Those guys are going to battle it out. Those guys have experience. So I'm more confident in the Colts if Carson Wentz can get it together. That's the main tipping point for me. And I'm a little skeptical just because he collapsed at such a dramatic degree last year. It's going to be a lot of work to put him back together again. And I think right now, heading into the season, the Titans are the better team just because of Tannehill and him and that upgrade that he provides over Wentz. But if Wentz can get it together, man, I think the Colts can take it. So those are the top two teams. I really don't think the Jaguars and the Texans are quite in that discussion yet. With the Texans, I mean, even if Deshaun Watson is playing, which is, beyond this, even if he is, that roster is far and away one of the worst, most dismantled rosters in the league. It's going to take a multi-year rebuild for them. I'm not confident this year. It's going to take a long time. And then the Jaguars too, they're a team with a lot of young talent. But Urban Meyer has a big task ahead of him. He's kind of at the start of another multi-year rebuild. I think we're going to see some flashes from Trevor Lawrence, sunshine, but I don't think the clouds are parting completely just yet.
I do agree with a lot of that, what you said, Ian. And one thing I'll throw out there too, that when you look at these teams, when you look at the Indianapolis Colts, I feel like defensively, they might be well suited right now to maybe stop that Tennessee Titans offense, or at least give them a little bit of hassle there. I think Darius Leonard is one of the best linebackers in the National Football League. You mentioned the young talent of Julian Blackmon in the secondary side of things. I do think that the Colts are a team that is probably the favorite right now for me. If I had to put somebody as number one, I think it would be the Colts. And I also want to make the argument too a little bit here for Carson Wentz. I do agree that there are reasons to be skeptical about Wentz and maybe what he can do in Indy based on what we saw from him last year in Philadelphia. But when I go back and I watch that Philadelphia team from last year, I see a team that Carson Wentz was trying to do too much because everything around him was not fitting. Now, I'm intrigued to see about the wide receiver core for the Colts. Pittman Jr. coming in, obviously, for another season here. T.Y. Hilton coming back, deciding to return. I think that there's a lot of talent, untapped talent also in the Indianapolis Colts rotation. I think a strong running game as well will help alleviate some of that pressure Wentz may feel. Tennessee, look, you have Julio Jones, you have A.J. Brown, you have Derrick Henry, you have Ryan Tannehill. I think that the addition of Julio Jones, when you factor him opposite A.J. Brown, Obviously, that is a big-time addition over Corey Davis, who they had lost in free agency. But now the question remains, who steps up at the tight end position? Because we saw Tannehill go to the tight end. Jonnu Smith last year, multiple times, one of the best red zone tight ends in the NFL last season. Obviously, now with the Patriots, that's a question there. Jacksonville, I feel like, will finish third because of the young talent that they do have defensively. The question is, what does Urban Meyer do? Will Tim Tebow be a major part of the offense, or is he even going to make it out of training camp? That's a laughable storyline we'll talk about now. But then the Houston Texans, I'm in agreement with you. I think that they are a roster that is far below the average standard right now. They have a lot of players on one-year rental deals. Tyrod Taylor, obviously, if he is going to be the starting quarterback this upcoming season, I'd be intrigued to see what type of dynamic they decide to run with. They have a lot of running backs right now on the roster, so we'll see how things play out. But ladies and gentlemen, let us know if you agree with our AFC South preseason division power rankings. How do you have it ranked? Let us know in the comment section down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel for daily exclusive NFL content, fantasy content, and NFL draft talk here at Pro Football Network.